Thank you very much indeed for that lovely introduction. It's lovely to be back for a second time. The first time, which was, I'm still trying to locate the exact month, but it was in the middle of the pandemic. And it was so end of 2020 or beginning of 2021. And we were over in the other part of the building, socially distanced, but we had a great time talking about my previous book, Why the Germans Do It Better, which had the hilarious fortune of becoming a bestseller in Britain of all places. But that was the Britain that, as Germans like to call it, the Insel, the island now, or die Party-Insel, thanks to COVID-busting prime ministers, and or clown country, or whatever else you wish to call it, which does not mean, of course, that Germany does not have its problems. It has many and varied problems, which we can talk about. So after as you just heard, I was in Berlin. I was incredibly fortunate. I was a correspondent, a young trainee correspondent for Reuters in Bonn, when Bonn was the capital in 1986-88, which was fun, but not particularly exciting. And then I went to Berlin, or rather East Berlin. I was that newspaper's first and last correspondent to the DDR. I lived in this wonderful high-rise building on a street called Leipziger Straße, opposite Checkpoint Charlie. There was myself, a Yugoslav journalist, and everybody else was Stasi, the secret police. And how did I know that? Well, first of all, they all had access to the 9th floor, and I didn't. And secondly, they all wore these wonderful grey plastic shoes. And thirdly, I would always say in the lift in the morning, "Morgen," morning, and would be famously grumpy. And I never bothered locking my apartment, because if they wanted to go in, they would go in anyway. So I'll talk a little bit about the events then, but I want to talk in my introductory remarks about why I love Berlin and about the history that impelled me to embark on a second book on Germany, the first being Why the Germans Do It Better, this one In Search of Berlin, the story of a reinvented city. So Berlin has had 750, oops, this keeps on going down because I keep on leaning on it, 750 going on 800 years of history. It is a history, and I'll read out the first few pages as my introduction because I think they sum it up well, of a city that has never been at ease with itself, but it is a city that, in my view, is now at the heart of Europe, and it is at the heart of, I think, the big debates about the world as it is now. It's an unconventional history, it's a personal history, it's partly chronological, it's partly thematic. At its heart, the key theme driving it through, which is particularly pertinent for nowadays, is migration or immigration. The city, a bit like New York, has been built by people coming from elsewhere. It was originally 2 tiny little trading posts in the most godforsaken area. I mean, it was the most unlikely sighting for a capital. Absolutely flat as a pancake, exposed to the chill winds of Siberia coming from the east. It had nothing going for it. And originally, not much happened to it for the first several hundred years. If you compare Berlin's trajectory with London, with Paris, and elsewhere, it took Berlin 300 or 400 years to become a city of significance. But at every step of the way, at every era of destruction or self-destruction, it was outsiders that made Berlin. So it was originally populated a lot by Slavs, and then the 30 Years' War, a war that Brits don't know about because not much happened. It wasn't fought in Britain as it would later become. It wasn't fought on the island. It was fought in the heart of Europe. More people died in the 30 Years' War in the 17th century per capita of population than in the First World War or the Second World War. Berlin and the surrounding area of Brandenburg was utterly devastated. And the city was born, reborn, reinvented by the Dutch and by the French Huguenots, the Protestants, who were forced to flee after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which was the guarantor of the rights of Protestants in a Catholic country. So these people all came, and they built Berlin. All the way through in the many centuries of Berlin's history, Jews have been absolutely central to the formation of thinking and of the economy of the city. And I wanted to write quite a lot about Jewish history of Berlin. And of course I talk about the Holocaust, of course I talk about the Hitler era, but I also wanted to look at it in the round from the first arrival of the Jews in the medieval times all the way through to the extraordinary Enlightenment era of Frederick the Great, which had Jews at the heart of it, including a philosopher by the name of Moses Mendelssohn. So I romp all the way through Berlin to through the eyes of people that come into the city. And I alight then, and there's some wonderfully charismatic, bonkers, crazy kings and electors, as they were called. There was the soldier king, who was obsessed with his son becoming a military person. And he used to walk around the streets of Berlin in disguise as a civilian. And if any man walking the streets was not wearing a uniform, or his shoes were not shiny enough, or his back was not straight enough, he would hit them with a cane, which I thought was a curious way to run a place as a king. And he begat Frederick the Great, and then after that we have the arrival of Napoleon, who, as well as dominating Berlin just for a few years, he goes off with the quadriga, the horses, on the top of the Brandenburg Gate, and takes them back to Paris and hides them in the Louvre, but they eventually get taken back to Berlin. It is only with the unification of Germany in 1871, there or thereabouts, that Berlin becomes the world city, the Weltstadt, that it always wanted to be. It really, for the first time, and we can talk about the present day, it rivaled London, Paris, and other cities as having everything you want from a city. Economics, finance, culture, science, newspapers, media, everything, education, great universities, everything was in that city, but it only lasted 40 years until the advent of the First World War, and everything went pretty much pear-shaped from then. And it's a fascinating question, therefore, about what is the role of a city, and does a capital city need to be a world city? So before I just talk a little bit about the 20th century, the century that everybody thinks about, I thought I would just read you just the first 3 pages of the book. It will save you having to read it yourself, but also it just, I think, gives you a flavour of what I'm trying to say. So here goes. I cannot get Berlin out of my mind. I have been living in it and coming to it for more than 30 years. First as a young journalist, based in the communist East, watching the dramatic events of 89 and 90, up to the present day, as the city is confronted by a new version of European conflict. It is a place where traumas are unleashed. It's also a place where the traumatized gather. The city's scars are a source of inspiration and a testament to the power of reinvention. Berlin is a laboratory. Even people who have spent brief periods in the city feel it's part of their lives. I certainly do. That's why I keep coming back. For much of its existence, Berlin has been dismissed as ugly, uncultured, and extreme. After the fall of the wall, it was expected to become more normal. Start-up entrepreneurs from around the world have been making it their home, providing the first significant economic activity for a long time. Gentrifying Germans from the south have arrived, supposedly bringing with them bourgeois respectability. Yet Berlin is still a mess. It can't run its own elections properly. It often fails to provide basic services. You can't get a death certificate. You can't get a birth certificate, people complain. It's grubby and often abrupt. It's a hodgepodge of architecture and a city planning nightmare. It's one of Europe's most sparsely inhabited capitals, and yet it suffers one of its most acute housing shortages, a problem it's struggled with for centuries. For decades, its standard of living has been below the national average. That's impossible in other countries. The city has few natural resources, no manufacturing to speak of, and not much wealth. Berlin has stumbled from enlightenment to militarism, from imperialism to democracy to dictatorship, from village to world city, briefly, to surrounded island. It has been a trading post, a military barracks, a centre of science and learning, industrial powerhouse, a hotbed of self-indulgence and sex, and a control centre for the worst experiment in horror known to man. It was at the heart of the Cold War, the front line of communism, and hangout for hippies and draft dodgers. It's been the site of 3 failed revolutions and 1 extraordinarily successful popular uprising. No other city has fretted so much about its status. No other city has had so many faces, so many disasters, and has reinvented itself so many times. No other city is so confused about itself and what it imagines to be in the future. Berlin is tortured by its history, and yet many buildings look as if they have no history. Each site, almost each paving stone, has lived many lives, each era superimposing itself on the one before. Each plague, each fire, each war, each act of destruction and self-destruction requires it to start again. Berlin is a place you project yourself onto, says David Chipperfield, the British architect who has left his stamp on the city with the reimagining of the Neues Museum and the Neue Nationalgalerie. Berlin, he says, is not really there. It's an idea. It's been a Prussian idea of a metropolis, a Nazi idea, an Allied idea, an East German communist idea, and more recently, a young people's idea. It's not a completed masterpiece, but it's a canvas on which different generations have painted. Berlin's shortfalls are tangible, and this is the point. It's unloved by those who fail to understand it. Its draw is more ephemeral and harder to identify. But when you get Berlin, it seeps into your skin. When he was made an honorary citizen of Berlin, the German president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, reminisced about doing his doctoral thesis there in 1989. A decade later, he and his family moved from Bonn, where the parliament was, to Berlin itself. He reminisced about the goatskin wallpaper and the pictures of Erich Honecker at his desk. He, like so many people down the ages, came to Berlin without understanding it. In a speech, however, in October 2021, he ventured to suggest that he now did. Berlin, he said, has throughout its history been a place of longing for those who found it too cramped elsewhere, who think more deeply, continue to research, reach higher, who want to change things or live differently. The alien, the different, the new are not rejected or excluded. They are curiously and hungrily embraced and absorbed. This openness characterizes Berlin like almost no other city I know. That's why Berlin is a magnet for people from around the world. People know they can leave a mark. And, as I mentioned, from Slavs to Jews, from Huguenots to Dutch, Russians to Turks, and now Afghans to Syrians, and latterly Ukrainians, they have. Berlin is the destination of choice for people who want to make a new life for themselves. You can always find your niche in Berlin. Everyone, it seems, comes from somewhere else. Everyone, it seems, has a story to tell. And I think that's really the heart of it. It is the place where, because it is so unfinished, because it is such a mess, because it was bombed and destroyed, and then for 40 or 50 years it was divided by a wall, it is still discovering itself. And when you look and when you compare it to the great cities of Europe, when you think of Paris or Rome or London or whatever, they feel as if they're already there, they're already done. Whereas Berlin, in my mind, is just at the start. It's just at the start of this incredible journey of people trying to think, what is their relationship between themselves, their friends, their families, and a city? How do you want to lead your life? And the pandemic has, of course, influenced that question a huge amount. Do you want glitzy high-rises? Do you want size and scale? I mean, Berlin, in population terms, is still smaller than it was at the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. It's only 3.5 million people. So it is still growing. I devote my last chapter of the book to looking at the present day. And I ask myself, and it's called fear of normality, and it's asked yourself, do you want a city to be normal? Because Berlin is completely not normal. Let me stop here and just ask all of you guys, if you divide up sort of, those of you who don't know Berlin at all, those of you who know it, I think you think a reasonable amount, and those who've either lived in it a long time or whatever, and know it very well. So how many of you don't know it at all? Okay, smattering. How many of you know it medium? A few more, quite a lot more. And those of you who kind of really know Berlin? One or two, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right. And then you have this wonderful relationship between Germans and Berlin, the unloved city, the city that was the island that was surrounded by the GDR. And when I think about, so let me just talk a little bit about the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and then I'll open it up to questions and observations and thoughts from all of you. And feel free to ask me about anything, really. I mean, it doesn't have to be about Germany, it could be about the world, it could be about whatever you want. It could be about football, if you feel like it, although don't talk about Chelsea, my team. So the late 19th century, I devote 2 chapters, because that is the period, as I say, well, that's when Berlin was kind of really happening. Everything was happening there. And then you have all the manifestations of a world city. You have huge rapid industrialization. Factories were opening everywhere. It was the place where Berliners are quite grungy. And at that period of the late 19th century, it was anything but that. It was high fashion. It was flaunting your wealth. If you went, it was department stores with massive chandeliers, incredible atriums and glass, and even had safe boxes so people could hide their gold bullion that they had just acquired when they went off for lunch to have champagne and oysters. It was the place of get rich quick and a lot of money at the same time. It's never been that before, and it's never been that since. It was also a time of incredible poverty, where people lived in these multiple courtyard houses called rental barracks. And the richer you are, the closer you were to the street, the more light you had, the more sanitation you had, and all the way through. But it was a time of incredible growth and incredible excitement. Then the First World War happened, and disaster struck. Then we had the Weimar Republic, which, as all of you who've watched Babylon Berlin and whatever have seen, it wasn't nearly as glamorous as it is. It was also a time of terrible exploitation, of drug abuse, of all kinds of mental health and social problems, as well as all of this glamour. And it was also obviously a time of incredible political tension and uncertainty. So then we move on to the Hitler era, and one of the pupils here was asking me to talk about that as well. I devote, obviously, a sizable chunk to the terrible 12 years of the Nazi arrival, the Second World War, and the Holocaust. And I think I've been to pretty much every single war memorial that exists in Berlin. Some of them are quite abstract and evocative, almost artistic. Some are incredibly raw and awful, and they tell a terrible story. And what's fascinating, and another of the themes of my book, is how the past interacts with the present. So you can walk down the street, modern 21st century Berlin, and everything's great, and then you come across this sort of terrible monument to horror. Then we have the division of Berlin. We have the two cities. We have the communist East, in which I happened to live for a few years, and West Berlin, the city of David Bowie, of people avoiding doing military service. It was completely surrounded. It was totally artificial. It was pretty wild and wacky. It was pretty poor and subsidized by the rest of Germany, and it was completely occupied by the three Western allies. It was the most, it was a moment in time, and you'll never have, I don't think, a city like West Berlin again. Then we come to unification, and I had the incredible good fortune, as I said, to be living in the East. Made friends very quickly, and took part in some of the usually environmental but other sort of civil liberties, human rights protests that often took place in churches. And what I would say, particularly nowadays with Germans feeling incredibly sort of down about that era and criticising it a lot, and feeling pretty down about themselves and criticising, talking about the AfD and the rise of nationalism and the rise of xenophobia and anti-migration stuff. It is a remarkable moment of, that was the time when it didn't need to be peaceful. It could have turned into terrible, terrible violence. And we were sitting in this church, we were surrounded by police, by army, with their guns, with searchlights, with barking dogs, and it could have gone the way of China and Tiananmen Square. It didn't need to happen the way it did. It didn't need to happen, unification and the fall of the wall, without a single person dying, being as both haphazard but also as incredibly peaceful and smooth as it was. There was no game plan, there was no whatever. It was the lunchtime of the day the wall came down. Nobody would have predicted, nobody would have said, this was going to happen and it's all going to follow this sort of mark and whatever else. It was absolutely spontaneous, but it was completely peaceful as well, which is an incredible testament to Germany and Germans. So then we have unification, and then the new story begins, which is now a question of what kind of city do they want to build. And I'll just leave you with this little anecdote. There's this wonderful place near where I actually live in Berlin called Tempelhof, which is this airport, this massive airport the size of Monte Carlo. And in the time of the kings, it was a marching parade ground for soldiers, the same in the Nazi time. It was when the Zeppelin balloons flew from, and Hitler turned it into a very bombastic airport. Then came the collapse of Nazism and the division of Berlin, and this was the place where the Allies, the Americans, helped by the Brits and the French, flew these incredible mercy flights to save West Berlin from being surrounded. So there's an amazing history of this place. The foreign forces leave. What do you do with this place? So the local authorities come up with this development of shops and houses and all the usual things that you develop parts of cities to. The locals kicked up rough and said, we don't want any of this. So 30 years later, this incredible site, the size of Monte Carlo, with a runway still there and lots of grass and weeds, is just the most giant hangout place for the whole of Berlin. People fly kites, they have barbecues. It was even said that a man walked his sheep, and we're talking about the center of Berlin. So you have this amazing sort of area of undiscovered land. Is that irresponsible because there's a housing shortage? Is it a bit sort of naive? Is it a bit sort of whatever, decadent? Or is it the sign of a city that just wants to be different, that doesn't want to be like everybody else? And will it become like everybody else? It is becoming like everybody else, but I don't think it will. I think it will to a certain degree, but not completely. Rents are going up, house prices are going up, people are coming from elsewhere, and it is becoming a lot more normal. But for me, it is the great city of reinvention. It is the place where anything can happen. It is the great music, clubbing scene place. It is the place where pretty much if you feel you can't do what you want to do somewhere else in your home country, in your hometown, you just go to Berlin and you can always do it. That's why I love this city, and I will plan to spend a lot more time there. Thank you very much. Right, so this is your test. As I always test with audiences wherever I am. I was doing something at the London School of Economics yesterday morning in London, and I was doing something else, and I've got to do something next week. I'm always loving to sort of see different audiences. Everybody comes out with wonderful, wild and wacky questions and observations and whatever. So the floor is yours. Do we have a microphone, a roving one, or do people just say whatever? Yeah, go on then. You've got two people there.
First of all, thank you. One very specific question. You started in 1988, as we just learned, as a journalist. November 9th, 1989, were you at the press conference where Schabowski, by accident, announced the end of the Berlin Wall?
No, my colleague was. There were two of us there. He was from West Berlin, and I was not. But then I went straight to Bornholmerstrasse, where the first people came out. But for those of you who don't remember that press conference, and this is where people are always kind of a bit too neat when it comes to history. They always say, oh, this thing happened because, you know, the weight of the contradictions, the East German economy was terrible, Gorbachev was there and things were loosening up. It's all true, but pardon the expression, it's all bollocks as well. Because actually, history is caused usually by accidents. And that was a complete accident. So the Politburo, the ruling Communist Party in a sanctum, realizing that things were happening and they would have to liberalize because the agitation was so strong and people were using other routes, as you know, through Hungary and elsewhere, through Prague, to leave East Germany to go to the West. They knew they had to liberalize. Their plan was somehow to liberalize the visa system, to make it easier, to reform communism, which was the Gorbachev idea. And then this old sort of walrus of a figure, Schabowski, was giving this press conference and muttered, not as the first item, but in the course of this, oh, and we plan to liberalize the travel regime for GDR citizens, at which point an Italian journalist said, and when? At which point he had no idea. He was looking through his notes, sort of, you know, there was no answer to that question because none of them had thought about it. And he said, ab sofort, straight from now. At which point everybody sort of rushes out and the word reaches the streets and people start testing the border crossings, and the poor border guards didn't know what to do and let them out. They could have shot them. They could easily have shot them. This could have been, you know, a terrible massacre, because Egon Krenz, who was the short-lived new Communist Party leader, had just been in Beijing and had just publicly praised the way the Chinese had dealt with Tiananmen Square by opening fire and killing lots of people. And that could easily, this is my point, this is why, you know, Germans, as you are, you're German? Yeah. Are incredibly self-critical. They always think that they're doing something wrong and that things aren't right, and sometimes things aren't right. But I still ask myself, where else could you have had those amazing events, and those amazing events have been carried out so peacefully. Imagine North Korea, South Korea, it's not going to happen that way. So it was incredible, it was luck as well. There was a huge amount of luck and coincidence and all of that. But the way those events, it wasn't just the wall coming down, it's the 11 months that happened. Since nobody wanted it to happen as quickly as that. Helmut Kohl talked about a 10-year period. But it was, it happened through its own spontaneous momentum, not because anybody wanted to make it as quick as it was. But when it did happen, for all the complaining, and justified complaining that people have about some of the parts of unification, I still think it was a remarkably successful period, and I still think that to this day. But I'm sure people want to ask me about the AFD or other questions. You wanted to ask a question?
Can I just?
Yeah, exactly.
Can I just?
Yeah.
Maybe it's because I'm Irish, not German.
You're Irish, not German.
Take issue with your idea that it was bollocks. I mean, I would submit to you the reason it happened is that we didn't have Deng Xiaoping in power, as in Beijing, but we had Mikhail Gorbachev in power in Moscow, and he made it perfectly clear that the Brezhnev doctrine no longer applied. Honecker and Milka wanted to send in the troops. They would have shot.
Yeah.
But they knew there was no backing from Moscow. In that sense, it was not chance. It was not just a luck. It was very much a policy for which we have to thank Gorbachev.
Your point about thanking Gorbachev, I completely agree with. Totally agree with. And after unification, the day after unification, I went to Moscow for the next 5 years, and I saw the, again, hugely spontaneous set of transitions from Gorbachev to Yeltsin, which was the only optimistic time in Russia's existence until it started all going really badly wrong when Yeltsin started taking to drink in the mid-90s, and then that led to Putin and everything else since then. But I would answer your wider point with a very German Jein, yes and no. Yes, your point that Gorbachev was absolutely on it, and his famous remarks. I was at that event at Fackelzug, where the procession to mark the great successes of East Germany and Gorbachev said, slightly misquoted to Honecker, problems await those who wait too long. However, it's not always about what the leaders decree. In these situations, and the 1848 revolution is exactly a testament to that, and lots of other things. All it needs is for one nervous, trigger-happy soldier, border guard, or middle-ranking commander to give an order to stop the people going over the wall, and all hell would have broken loose. And those around the leadership, they all disappeared that night. They literally all disappeared. They all went off to Bandits and to their dachas outside, leaving no commands for anybody. But that doesn't mean it could have gone peacefully, because there are so many examples where a peaceful option could have happened, but something went wrong.
How freely could you report in 1988, 1989? Do you know if before you sent what you wrote was published, was it read by the Stasi, or could you write whatever you wanted?
Well, it was a slightly weird situation because as a Western ally, I could go from east to west, and I quite often did, 2 or 3 times a day. You know, go and meet a friend in the evening in Schöneberg or Charlottenburg or Kreuzberg or whatever, and I would just go over or go to the supermarket and come back in your car or whatever. I tried not to do that too much for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it took me a little bit of time to understand what I should have understood on the first day, which is that it was quite upsetting to my East German friends that I could do that. And secondly, one of the key rules of journalism, in my opinion, is immersion. So go full in, try to lead the lives, insofar as it's possible, of the people that you are reporting about. And if I'm just, off to some nice French restaurant in Schöneberg or whatever, I'm not really leading that life. But no, I was followed. I enjoyed reading my Stasi file from East Berlin and from Bonn, where they thought that I was a British agent, particularly in Bonn. But, that's fine. And you were followed, and your phone was tapped, and everything else. But they couldn't actually stop you, because if I wanted to, I could have just walked over or driven over and sent. But this was before the internet, by the way. So you usually had to dictate it down a phone line. But I could have done that from West Berlin anyway. So no, nothing was. But you had to, particularly in East Germany and obviously in the Soviet Union, you had to protect your sources. So you just, the bigger concern was not restrictions on what I could report, but just to be careful that anything I report didn't get somebody into trouble. Do you want to take it?
So watching this in 1989, we see Gorbachev influencing it, obviously, and then we see this spontaneous uprising, and it went the way you talk about. Well, I know you were in East Berlin, but did you have a sense of what was going on in other East German cities? Was what happened, did it kind of explode in Berlin and then blast out into the rest of Germany, or was there kind of a emotional, psychological, political support starting to happen in the rest of the country as well that supported it?
The morning of the evening the wall came down, I was in Leipzig. It was the day before. Leipzig was really where at least as much of the agitation was taking place. And in Berlin it was around the Gethsemane Church, and in Leipzig it was the St. Nicholas Church. And those were the biggest demos, actually. They really, really kicked off. And Berlin, in some ways, was playing catch-up. I mean, in some ways, Berlin, it was both incredibly tense and obviously incredibly upsetting for East Germans to see a wall that they couldn't go across. But it was also in some ways, a lot more relaxed, because you could watch West German TV wherever you could. There was just that sense of and West Berliners were crossing over every day on the S-Bahn from Friedrichstrasse or various 3 or 4 road connections. So it felt like a completely alien place, but it didn't feel completely alone. Leipzig was also not like that. Dresden and the area of southeast East Germany, which has its effects even now today, was because it was in a valley, it could never receive West German TV. And one of the reasons, I think a lot of people argue, and I would argue, that there's a certain part, particularly of Saxony and of Thuringen, that is particularly susceptible to the promises of the AfD, as they were loyal communists, is you have several generations that didn't know anything else. And the exposure to sort of Western media was always very limited, in a way that in Berlin, in Leipzig, and in other cities, it wasn't. But no, there were demonstrations elsewhere, but it was particularly in those 2 cities that it really kicked off. Yeah, well, there's lots of questions. Lady there. Up there, and then the guy right at the back.
Yes, John, hello, Kampfner.
Yeah. Is it on? Otherwise, you just have to bellow.
Just shout.
Yeah.
Otherwise, can you hear me?
I can, but absolutely.
Okay.
I think something might have switched off on the way, or the battery's gone dead.
Can't seem to get it on.
Right.
No. Anyway, I will speak up.
Yeah, just speak up.
Yeah, Caroline Wunderlich is my name, and I really enjoyed. I always enjoy listening to you, but I share so much of the fascination of the watching and experiencing 1979 when I was about to go to university to study German, and I had absolute fascination and decided I wanted to go to Berlin to see what it was like, and I was age 17, decided I would go over Checkpoint Charlie to see what East Germany was like, which was probably one of the most foolish things I could have done, but it was probably dangerous, and I managed to get over. I think the guards were so perplexed as to why a 17-year-old English girl wanted to go over to East Germany that they sort of let me through and back again without too much hassle. But I've never forgotten what it was like, and now when I walk up and down to Linden and see it sort of transformed and watch that transformation, I've never forgotten what it was like, and the deep scars which are still left. And I wanted your thoughts on a couple of things. First of all, you mentioned it just now, but this sort of ongoing tension between what was the former East and the current sort of former West, and how that's tried to grow together, particularly in Berlin, but we're seeing it in so many ways in the political movements, how it's those tensions and differences of opinion, particularly now vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine, is actually really resurfacing again. Secondly, the problem that Berlin has about really not ever, well, being a German capital, but not for very long, unlike Paris or Berlin, Paris or London, being capitals for centuries. It was actually a very short time it was actually all of Germany. And it's now that again, but if you're in Munich, or if you're in Hamburg, or you're in Frankfurt as the financial capital, it's still different, and it's coming to terms with how to manage being a German capital and not just a Prussian as it was. And thirdly, how that affects, therefore, the way that Berlin is seen on the global stage, because living here, I know there's always so much expectation about what's coming out of Berlin. My sense is, when I'm in Berlin, that people underestimate just quite how much of the world of Europe and the rest of the world looks to Berlin for those signals, and that's another problem that we're dealing with in the current climate.
Lots of points there, and I agree with that. There's each chapter begins with a quote from a famous person. It could be Turgenev or Schopenhauer or Balzac or David Bowie or Ai Weiwei about Berlin. My favourite one is the former French culture minister Jacques Lang, who said, and I still don't quite know what it means, but it's a very funny quote. Paris is always Paris, but Berlin is never Berlin. It basically sort of means nobody quite can work out what it is. And it is true. I mean, there's no other, on the one hand, it is, in my view, the centre of Europe. Brussels people might disagree. But, in terms of, all the big negotiations on Ukraine, on what to do with European enlargement and the Balkans, and possibly on the Asia Pacific and everything. It just feels like everybody comes to Berlin, possibly in a way as Brits would like to think it used to happen in London, but doesn't happen anymore. I just feel that, and yet 300 meters from the Chancellor's office, you have an allotment garden, right? So you just have this sort of weird thing of you walking around Berlin, incredible things happening, and then it just looks like a village. And it is both global and incredibly provincial at the same time. Which is partly is the way Berliners like it. It is changing in that regard. But it is sort of, it's both, the German, it's always been, Germany has always been, because it was never a country, it was a collection of city-states and regions and whatever, but obviously increased by the Allied occupation and the formation of the new Federal Republic, based in the Länder, and the capital being in Bonn was like a sort of afterthought. It was just like a small thing, but actually the real action was taking place in Frankfurt and Munich and Hamburg and Cologne and Düsseldorf and elsewhere. To a degree that's changed, Berlin is definitely where a lot of the action is, but all the finance, as you all know, is in Frankfurt. A lot of the media is still in Hamburg. A lot of advertising, insurance is in Munich. All the car industry is in Munich and Stuttgart and elsewhere in the south. Loads of things happen. It's both a benefit. If you look at Britain, France, other countries, they're so dominated by the capital city. And Germany is the exact opposite. And you can argue it both ways. It doesn't have this big, chest-out, dominant capital city in the way that others do. On the other hand, it's a lot more equal. You do not have, as in Britain and in France, huge inequalities of wealth between the capital city and elsewhere. As I said in that introduction that I read out, it was only until a couple of years ago, the per capita income of Berliners was lower than the national average. Imagine that. I can't think of a single country in the world where that would apply. So it's in that developed. Germans and other Germans have always had a very mixed view of Berlin. A lot of them look down on it, and they certainly look down on Konrad Adenauer as the first chancellor of post-war Germany, had absolute disdain for Berlin. He called it the Asian Steppes. He wasn't remotely fussed when the Berlin Wall started to be built in 1961. He'd have been quite happy to trade Berlin away. It was Willy Brandt as the mayor of Berlin, and the Americans, who really kicked up rough and tried to salvage the city. Because if the airlift had not happened, and if the blockade had succeeded, Berlin would have given up. It would have been taken over. And at one point, there was consideration of giving the GDR Berlin having Thuringia instead. You imagine, how history would have happened on that. I'm not sure, does that answer all your points, or some of it? But it is still a very curious relationship between Germans. I often think Germans struggle with Berlin more than foreigners do.
May I follow up on that question, because if I may, because the German Constitution, written in 1949, the last chapter specifies Berlin is the capital of Germany.
Yeah.
Until reunification, Bonn will serve as an addendum.
Yeah.
And there was, starting by the Allies, Berlin blockade, constant support for West Berlin. What would have happened? Do you really it would have happened if there would not be this constant support, which was enormous cost for that? If that specification would not be given, and sort of that West Germany should not give up their, let's say, original capital into that. If that would not have happened, so it would be sort of merged, integrated.
I mean, the first unification, 1871, there was a lot of consideration about where the capital would be. It was not certain that it would be Berlin. Could easily have been Frankfurt. It could have been Augsburg. It could have been other places as well were under consideration. When the Bundestag, after unification, was having its vote about moving the capital from Bonn to Berlin, the final result was incredibly close. It could easily, it was just by a few votes. There were a lot of people, particularly Abgeordnete, particularly members of Parliament, who enjoyed having their nice, gemütlich life on the Rhine and didn't want to move. And they also made the case, and it is a correct case, that it's not just the geography of an entire country changes, because as you know, from Bonn to Berlin is a long way. It's the whole mentality. Basically, Germany moved from being very based in the West, right on the Dutch, Belgian, French border, very sort of in the heart of American post-war life, influenced strongly by the Brits in Northern Rhine-Westphalia and all of that. It was a very sort of allied temporary city to being in Berlin, which was very, very different. So it wasn't just a geographic change. It was a huge change from the Bonner Republic to the Berliner republic. So it didn't need to be this way. And Berlin has, it did not have the life. It's not like London or Paris or whatever. There's always been the capital. In my argument, it could have been elsewhere. But I'm very pleased it wasn't. It's a complete change. Right, you up there? You wanted to ask a question? Yeah, go on.
I wanted to ask you what aspect of Berlin's culture do you think is the most fascinating or unique, and why?
So a third of culture, did you say? So a third of people who go to Berlin go for the music scene. Of all tourists, they go to the clubs. Have you been?
I've never been.
No.
I've been only once to Germany to Bonn for a football game.
Right. Well, I mean, some people say that the kind of big clubbing scene, which was huge in the mid-late 90s and the 2000s, it's sort of become less cool now, less interesting now. Than it was. A lot of people, a lot of it is people say in Leipzig, and which has got the nickname Leipzig for being sort of regarded as sort of ultra cool and interesting. Partly because prices have gone up so much. The idea of just hanging out in Berlin and doing some graffiti, and doing some music and having fun is not so cheap anymore as it used to be. And also the place was full of empty buildings. It was just awash with buildings that were former factories or warehouses or abandoned this, they were all falling down. They were amazing places to do art, to do different kinds of cultural interventions and stuff. And now, you don't get so many buildings like that because, they've all been spruced up and sort of made much more sort of modern and conventional. But I mean, Berlin's just got so much culture. It's got, as I say, the music scene. It's got a really vibrant classical music scene. The Philharmonic is one of the great classical music buildings of Europe. It's got incredible art scene, with some of the great museums and art galleries and stuff. It's really kind of got. It just depends what are you into?
I like music.
You like music? Yeah. I mean, it's got every type of music, every type of gigs, every type of clubs, but also music of every single genre as well. And if you haven't been, it's time you went. Right. Yeah.
I think you kind of answered it already now, but I just wanted to ask, when you were talking about it being a canvas where generations obviously built upon or paint upon, what picture would you paint right now to define Berlin in 2024?
It's funny, I was asked a similar question by a journalist from Der Spiegel who interviewed me. And the final question he said was, if Berlin was a person, how would you describe it? And I must write that I can't remember exactly what I said, but I said hyper-intelligent, inquisitive, curious, exciting, one other adjective, neurotic, and goes for therapy once a week, which I kind of think is Berlin. I mean, it's sort of, it's constantly sort of buzzing and asking itself, difficult questions. It doesn't feel, I don't think there's any complacency about it. It doesn't feel all there, which is the whole painting of the canvas. In a way, it's like New York was sort of 20, 30 years ago, but now New York, and particularly Manhattan, is so expensive, that you can't really get cultural people to go there because they can't afford it. You need sort of shabby chic, you need, to quote the former mayor Paul Betsepsi, you need that sort of sense of a place that's vibrant, but also not polished. And Berlin is absolutely not polished. And I hope that stays that way. But on the other hand, I also want it to be a city where everything works, which it doesn't. I mean, in September 2021, when I was asked by this organization called the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, to be an election observer, and along with about 12 other people from around the world, including, curiously, Russians and Chinese, to write a report about the German elections, were they free and fair and all of that, I mean, typically, you wouldn't have a Brit or a French asking sort of other people to sort of, they would just sort of gerrymander their elections, or at least the Brits would, and sort of, and not sort of invite comments from outsiders. But anyway, so that day of the elections, the Berlin city government, in its infinite madness, forgot that the Berlin Marathon was taking place on the same day. And so the whole centre of Mitte was, you just couldn't get the ballot boxes into the places. People were queuing for hours. The whole thing was a complete disaster. Very sort of un-German in terms of the old cliche of German efficiencies. And it was so bad that there was a court case and they had to rerun the local part of the elections, which they did about a year later with a very different result. So, there's always a sort of only in Berlin moment, on so many things that happen there. Yeah.
What impact has Berlin, the city, had on German politics?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I mean, I partly began to address that with that point about it wasn't just a geographical move from Bonn, it's also a spiritual move right into, Berlin is a Central European city. It is not a Western European city. It's an hour from the Polish border. You feel very much, it's very interesting, the whole question of diversity in Berlin. Berlin is still, when you compare it to British cities, French cities, and it's still much more white than other, notwithstanding the 2015 large migration influx. But that doesn't mean it's sort of monocultural at all, because a combination of just a huge influence of Central and Eastern and Southeastern Europe. You just feel it everywhere in Berlin. And the other one is the guest workers from the 1970s onwards, the Turkish influence, the Yugoslav influence, and the Southern European influence. And obviously since 2015, and Angela Merkel's controversial, I still think amazingly enlightened and incredible decision to let in more than 1 million people, mainly from the Middle East, but also from North Africa. Of course, they didn't all go to Berlin, they were dispersed around the country. But that has absolutely changed the face of Germany and Berlin as a city. But I mean, the key point about Berlin is it remains what it was. It's an island surrounded by the GDR. And everywhere around Berlin is still the influence of the old GDR. And that is changing. And the GDR was not monolithic. The GDR, different regions had different things going on and different, insofar as it was a one-party state, different political attitudes. But it's just that sense of a recalibration of Germany's physical location or emotional location. Which brings to the point I think you were asking, which I didn't really answer, which is about the whole approach to Ukraine and Russia and elsewhere. I mean, in this book, which is largely chronological but not completely, I devote 2 special chapters. One to the history of the Jewish history of Berlin, and which obviously has a lot about the Holocaust, but it's about far, far more than that, all the way through over the centuries. And the incredibly, and that's the terrible sadness of the Holocaust, is that Berlin was always a very Jewish city. And in the late 19th century, it felt like that as well. When the new synagogue was consecrated in 1866, that amazing synagogue with the Moorish domes that you can see for miles around on the Oranienburger Straße, it was the hottest ticket in town. Bismarck was there, the Kaiser was there, all the ministers were there, everybody who was anybody wanted to be there. Which is a real sort of sense of what then happened 70 years later. I wouldn't say it's anomalous, because there's always been or anti-Semitism and a terrible story, but it just felt a very, very different city. So I do a chapter on that, but I do a chapter on the Russian history of Berlin. After the 1917 revolution, there's always been Russian history. I mean, Catherine the Great, originally German, huge amounts of Germans in Russia all the way through, and some of them were regarded as suspect. At the time of the revolution, Stalin regarded a lot of them as suspects and locked them up. And then you have the whole story of the GDR, where they were basically all in exile in the Soviet Union and came back, Walter Ulbricht and Peak and others. And this absolute intertwining of German and Russian history that you don't really feel, and you never really felt in Bonn, but absolutely you do feel. And it has so many different layers. I've always been incredibly hawkish on Russia. Living there and having many, many Russian friends has made me even more hawkish about, I'm a great Russophile, but also very, very hardline on Russia as a political and military threat. But after the 1917 revolution and the almost successful communist revolution in Germany in January 1918, there were 400,000 Russians in Berlin. There were whole areas of Berlin where Russian was the lingua franca. And it just felt, and that continued pretty much all the way through the 1920s. And in some ways it still feels like that now. There is still that sort of sense of, which makes the whole Zeitenwende and makes the whole events of the last 2 years, and in a way other European countries don't really quite understand, it makes it all the more difficult, because the Germans regarded Russians as their cousins, and often against the evidence, and often a sense of wishful thinking rather than realism, going back really since the advent of Putin, or a few years after he got in the mid-noughties. And so it was a real sort of severing of something that happened 2 years ago and is continuing to happen now. I can't remember what your original question was.
What impact does the city of Berlin itself have on German politics?
Well, yeah, I hope that sort of answers it. It does. I mean, it is much more centralised. I mean, all of you who know the rest of Germany, if you're in Bavaria or in Baden-Württemberg or whatever, it just feels like a very, very different country and a very different. But it's by just a little bit here and there, it is becoming more centralised. So much more decision making is there. But I mean, one of the great joys of Germany is that, as it pertains to other countries as well, but particularly in Germany, that different regions just feel very, very different. Oh, sorry. Yes, go on. You go first.
Did you enjoy writing the book, and did you learn a lot about Berlin?
I learned a lot about Berlin. Did I enjoy writing the book? That was my 7th book, right? And I just started my 8th. And I can tell you, it doesn't get any easier. You think it does, but because you've done it a lot of before. But it's really, really hard. I mean, it's great fun. I mean, I walked everywhere. I loved, basically, this book is a sort of critical love affair that I have with Berlin. And I did lots and lots of research in libraries and reading books and stuff. But most of the research was just walking the streets. And if you like walking, and if you like going to different places and seeing different things and being surprised and meeting interesting people, I absolutely loved doing it. But when it then gets down to on your computer, that betrays my age, on my computer typing away, sometimes you think, oh God, do I have to keep on doing this? Can't I do something a bit more fun? But I got there in the end. Somebody here wanted, and then go there, then.
What do you think about Berlin within the reality of the Green Deal and all the sustainability, the challenges they have in Europe?
It's good. I mean, really good question. I don't think it's a particularly Berlin point. I think it's a Germany. It's a Germany point. There's nothing particularly different in that way about Berlin.
This process, or they are not? I mean, Berlin is not really advancing.
No, it's not, and in some ways it's got. The new city government in Berlin is actually getting rid of cycle lanes, and as all countries are sort of strange contradictions of things, but Germany's love affair with the car shows no sign of, or a little sign of change. And of course some cars have become electric or hybrid, and that's good, but, and I don't have a car in Berlin, but I use those cars that you can borrow for an hour or two or whatever, and it is still the case almost all the time in almost all journeys that driving is the fastest way to get from one place to another, as opposed to cycling or public transport. A couple of recent trips I made to Paris, I was amazingly pleasantly shocked at what Anne Hidalgo has done in terms of the greening of Paris and cycle lanes everywhere, and I just think that city has blossomed. It's an amazing sort of moment for all sort of French. We're all having great anxiety about the world and about Europe, but I think Paris as a city has just modernized and become more environmental at the same time in a really exciting way, which Berlin has not done. In London, I'm fortunate that I live in the centre of London, and during the pandemic we had an old car and it just broke down. We just got rid of it. I've never had a car for the last 4 years, because when I do take a hire car, it takes about twice or 3 times longer in a car than it does, which in Berlin is not the case, and I wish it was the case in Berlin. I wish everybody would get out of their cars. But at the same time, you know, it's the only country with a major Green Party. Germany's current performance on net zero and other things is kind of mixed. It's not brilliant. Every country's got its pluses and minuses. So it is, and there is such a big kind of culture war battle now about Greens, who are seen as kind of liberal, metropolitan, elite people versus the real people who drive cars, so you know there's a real political battle for the environment. We saw, I don't know if you saw it yesterday or was it this morning, the latest figures about 1.5 degrees every day over the last year. And, I mean, the figures are terrible. But at the same time, there was a period when I felt that Germany was leading the way on this. And it's doing pretty well on some things, on renewables, on solar, it's very good on wind farms. But it still emits far too much.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about the link between Russians and Germans. And I was wondering, what is the perception of German people? How do they perceive or how do they feel about the role of one of the former presidents, Schroeder, and the relationship with City and the war with Gazprom? In Russia, do they take it with humor? Do they feel ashamed? Do they criticize it vocally, or are they kind of keeping low? Is this a matter of pride of ethos?
You're talking about Schroeder?
Yes,
yeah.
In Gazprom, the relationship we have with Putin, being such an important person, because at the end of the day, he's a former president of the Republic. How do they take it?
Well, the first thing I would say, as a qualification before answering your question, is that Brits, and I'm British, but I'm also now proudly German, but Brits love to be rude about other countries, particularly Europeans. And but before any Brit criticizes any country about its relationship with Russia, they should remember that their capital, London, has been for 30, 40 years the money laundering capital of the world. It just, so much of Britain's wealth has been based around a service industry of corrupt people. And to a degree that's utterly reprehensible and awful. So I always have to say that before I say that I think Gerhard Schröder is an utterly despicable, reprehensible figure for embracing Putin the way he did. And he did it unashamedly. He did it for all kinds of reasons of gratification. I have many German journalist friends, and I do still get quite cross with them about why they didn't investigate Schröder and his links with Putin more vigorously in the early years. They've done that since the invasion, but it was staring in front of them. Schröder acting as Putin's lapdog, and I really, really find his approach awful, and I don't know why he is not regarded as a complete national pariah, as I think he should be.
If I may ask a follow-up question, so I know the timing aspects of history. You might have an opinion on that, but when we talk about Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, I wonder, you could consider that Schröder had some sort of collusion with Putin, but would it be Merkel?
Well, so I was going to come to that. No, I was going to come to that.
How critic would be the opinion of the leaders, both Schröder and Merkel?
I think Schröder is in a different category because it was personal, it was self-gratification, it was an ego trip, it was very specific. There's a separate but related question, which is Germany's long-standing energy dependency on Russia. And it was based in, I think, and Merkel, when she left, everybody, Germans and foreigners, thought, oh my God, how are we going to survive without her? She was such a great figure for 15 years. She was an absolute hero in every way. And then as soon as the invasion happened and Germany's dependence on oil and gas became more obvious, she went from hero to zero, right? And I think the correct assessment of Merkel is much more in the middle. I'm more positive. But, she made mistakes. In my view, she made, in the energy front, she made two mistakes, and they're related. She panicked after Fukushima and bringing forward Germany's withdrawal from nuclear energy, which is so different to France, which is just, quite proudly sees it as that. People can have their own points of view about that. But in doing that, she extended the life of fossil fuel burning plants and did a lot of harm to Germany's green credentials. But more importantly, she prolonged and extended Germany's energy dependency on Russia. Now, I followed Merkel quite a lot, and if you see the body language of Merkel with Putin, she never liked him. She always found him a problem. I don't know if you've seen that famous video of Putin and his Labrador dog, Connie, knowing that Merkel has a phobia about dogs, and he brings the dog into the meeting room at his Dacha Palace in Sochi to freak her out. And to which Merkel, when she saw this dog, she was literally trying not to have a panic attack. But she came out with a great line to Putin in front of journalists, does he kill journalists as well? Meaning the dog, which I thought was quite clever. She was a realist. She was never, oh, I love Putin, what can I do to be nice to him, in a way that Schröder was. But she took the view, which was quite fashionable at the time everywhere, but she held onto it longer than everybody else held onto it, which was the German phrase, Wandel durch Handel, which basically changed through trade. So that the more you tie in an autocratic, authoritarian regime into the liberal, democratic, free market world, the more you will change them.
This is for China, but then the question is, it doesn't work.
Exactly. That's exactly the words I was going to use. It was wrong on China, it's wrong on Russia, it's naive, but she wasn't alone. Everybody was doing it. The Brits were laying out the red carpet for Xi Jinping in 2014. Everybody had their own phrase for the great rapprochement with China, and everybody thought, and in some ways, it belonged to its time. But particularly after 2014 and the first invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, and Putin getting worse and worse and worse progressively, and then obviously Xi Jinping with his takeover, his destruction of Hong Kong and the democratic system there, it was blindingly obvious. But Germany just kept on holding on to it for far too long. But within a year of the pipeline being blown up, and Germany managed to completely transform its energy profile, which was an incredible achievement. But there's definitely a lesson, to be learned. But I do think for Merkel, it was a political and philosophical error. But I think Schröder was not that, it was different. Yes?
John, I very much enjoyed your first book, so I'm looking forward to reading your book on Berlin. I'm interested to know, in recent times, Germany has experienced a few bumps in the road. And you wrote extensively about why the Germans have been so successful, and we all admire Germany's post-war success. Has Germany lost its way? And if it has, how has it lost its way?
Every day I get stuff on social media about tee-hee-hee, that didn't end well, and all that sort of stuff about Germany, usually from sort of Brits with Schadenfreude who forget that their own country's head is down the proverbial toilet bowl at the moment. But the Germans love to call Britain, the Insel and Die Party Insel and all of that. And actually here, when you are in Brussels, as you folk are, the extent to which Britain just generally almost sort of doesn't exist in geopolitical terms is and no Brit, not even sort of internationalist pro-European Brit sitting in Britain has any idea how diminished, in my view, Britain has become. Could that begin to change after what I hope will be a particular general election result this autumn? I think it will begin to change slowly, but what the speed and the gradient will be, we don't know yet. Germany is in so many difficulties now. Its economy is bumping. The big program, the coalition agreement of the three-party coalition, which formed 6 weeks before Putin invaded, was digitization and modernization. And so much of the oxygen has went out with the focus on Ukraine and having to completely redo the energy sources of the country, and completely reconfigure Germany as a robust security, geostrategic, military country, which sits so uncomfortably historically with modern Germany. And it's a work in progress, but it is, it is changing. I saw, and I'll come to answer your question, I was in Berlin last week, and two young Bundeswehr soldiers coming on the U-Bahn in their khaki, in their uniform. Nobody noticed, said anything, whatever, it was just all kind of normal. And I remember the times in the 80s and the 90s where you were told, if you're in the German military, never, ever, ever go in a public place in your uniform, because you'll be provoked, you'll be shouted at, people will call you a fascist, and they'll call you all kinds of things. And that's all, mercifully, that's all changed, I think, Germany in that respect. So that's a good side of Germany. The economy has, this modernization process has been delayed, hasn't happened. Germany's broadband speed slower than Albania's. There are very few places, you can't have a half an hour, 40-minute mobile phone conversation walking, all across Berlin, which I do a lot, in which the line doesn't cut out and die 3 or 4 times in the course of that conversation. Other countries have got a bit of that as well, but Germany is just particularly bad and sluggish, risk-averse. Its economy does need, a big recalibration. So you've got the Russia challenge, you've got that, and you've got the AfD. And I do fear across Europe that the European elections in June are going to be an absolute bloodbath. I think they're going to be awful everywhere. They're going to be awful in France. They're going to be awful in Italy. I think Spain, there'll be pushback against Pedro Sanchez. It's already awful in Hungary. The Nordics begun to embrace it, a fair amount. I just think it's going to be really, really difficult. And then Germany has the 3 state elections in the East in September. But, and this is the big but, which is perhaps the only sort of direct link between this book and the other book, I'm always reassured by the single component of Germanness that I think always sort of holds the country together, which is seriousness. In contrast to Britain, a friend of mine, and I put it in my first book, said to me one time, I was writing the Theresa May into Boris Johnson era, she said, "Oh, I've given up my Netflix subscription because I get all the entertainment I need watching British parliamentary channel." Right? In other words, sort of Parliament, Britain is a joke, sort of little funny public school one-liners and all sorts of stuff, but actually just sort of bumptious clowns. And I hope that, I think we reached peak clownishness, a couple of, a year and a half ago. And whatever sort of nothingness the Sunak regime is, it doesn't feel so clownish. And then hopefully, whatever the low to middling expectations are of Starmer, it's going to be deadly serious. He's a very serious, earnest person. And that earnestness about the way Germans talk about politics and do politics, I think is its constant cushion. And the news reports, which was slightly weird, this stuff, in this Correctif article about the repatriation, AfD, and worse conference in Potsdam, is that these sort of book and events have been taking place all the time. There's nothing particularly new about that presentation at all. It's just, as often with, once in a while with journalism, a particular story takes off and strikes a chord. And, the demonstrations and stuff have been incredibly good to see. So it's not just people realizing that, it's not just talking about, oh, isn't it terrible about the AfD, actually doing something about it and making it, some people will always vote AfD, but I think for some people it became just sort of a bit of a easy, rebel cause, and I think it's going to be a little bit more difficult for some people to do that with a straight face to their colleagues, and I think people who might otherwise have not voted will vote. And the 3-party coalition has, to a large extent, stopped bickering and realised there's a much bigger problem out there to solve. But fundamentally, it's also got to deal with the problems that have given rise, not just to the AfD, but to the RN in France, to all the different political, because the problems are largely shared. The political parties and the way they manifest themselves are largely shared across Europe as well. The other point I would just quickly make, and yes, another quick cheap jibe about Britain I would make, is that Brits have to say, oh, look at us, we don't have extremes like that. To which I would always say, actually our extremes are just incorporated into the mainstream. You look at someone like Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, I would say there's absolutely nothing separating her from Marine Le Pen, Giorgia Meloni, and Alice Weidel. I think they're all the same. It's just in Britain, they're already in the Conservative Party, whereas under a proportional system, they've got a clearer home in the extremes.
Thank you.
One more. Let's have a happy question. Let's have a cultural, zeitgeisty, not AFD or misery question to send us all on our beer and wine-filled ways. All right, come on, one of you at the back. One of you at the back, come on. Who's going to do it? Oh, yes, sorry, Jesus.
Well, this is a question that comes from a student.
Oh.
I suppose it's more about history.
Oh.
He would like to ask you what was the impact of Frederick the Great policies impacting the growth and development of Berlin and the surroundings.
Right. So Frederick the Great was the great contradiction. He was, so very, very quickly, his father, the soldier king, the widow who kept hitting people with his cane, was obsessed with the idea that his son Frederick was gay, which he was, and Frederick had a tutor who was also his lover in his teenage periods called Katter, and they were going to flee to England to escape the oppressiveness of the soldier king's regime. They got caught, Katter got put in prison, Frederick had to watch his tutor and lover get beheaded in front of him. And then starts this amazing question of how you interpret history. So Frederick the Great then becomes, according to one version of history, which is the sort of Prussian version, the Nazi version, and to a degree the East German version. This big military figure, fought and won 3 wars, expanded the Prussian realm, much decorated, big figure on the global stage, all of which is true. At the same time, Frederick ushered in the Enlightenment, this period of salons and philosophy and art and music and culture, and Berlin just became, this incredibly vibrant, exciting, and interesting place. He was also obsessed with France, and he banned the teaching of the speaking of German in his court. He regarded German as entirely vulgar and awful, and denounced Goethe for writing in German. He was obsessed with Voltaire, and it's a question of did he have a relationship with Voltaire or not? And I remember in Potsdam, which belonged to East Germany, where Frederick is buried with his dogs, asking back in the day GDR tour guides whether Frederick, what was the nature of Frederick's relationship with Voltaire, at which point they got very cross and sort of, told me to be a little bit more responsible. Whereas now it's a really interesting question of, so Frederick was both of these things. He was the big military leader, he was also the great cultural figure, and for years modern West Germans didn't know how to relate to Frederick because he was in this arc of big figures that formed this direct line, which the Nazis spoke about. Frederick leads to Bismarck, Bismarck leads to Hitler. So there's a very interesting historical discussion about how do you reinterpret Frederick for the modern era, and there's some really interesting discussions about that now. And I think the discussion, there was about 10 or 15 years ago a huge exhibition of Frederick's Prussia in the German Historical Museum in Berlin, and that was really and that's another really, really interesting question. One of the things I do in this book is I talk about the relationship all the time between history and the present day, both through buildings but also through discussions. So how you interpret people like Frederick the Great or Bismarck now in a modern context, I think is really interesting. Right, time for drinks.